thank you so much for coming along. I'm just doing these as kind of informal sessions. I want to put together a course of 4 different sessions, and I want to cover all the areas that I think really matter when you're presenting in public. And I know people have got very specific reasons for wanting to further their information. But I'll say right at the very beginning that I believe the only way to really convince people of something, to persuade them, is to get them to feel it, to get them to experience it, which is why I talk about using the emotional connection with the audience. Yes, I can say with 100% certainty, after doing it for so long, I mean, I think I gave my first speech, and I was young, I was raw. I was a community worker in Edinburgh, and I was asked to speak at the Institute of Cultural Arts in the Pall Mall in London. And I was terrified. You couldn't have got a job in the BBC if you spoke with a Scottish accent, unless you were commentating in football. But there I was with this audience that I felt totally alien from. And the guy who employed me to do it said, "I've heard you talking in Edinburgh about what you do there." And so I just spoke. I told funny stories. I spoke about how many people in the community of Leith, which is where I was based, had amazing talents, had skills, had stories, had backgrounds, had purpose and passion. And they absolutely loved it, because I was coming from a different culture. And you could not have separated the difference between where I was working in Leith and here were these people assembled in the Institute of Cultural Arts in London. And people spoke to me afterwards. And do you know what they loved? Stories. They know how to tell stories. Speeches weren't about stories in those days. They were about standing up and presenting information, presenting facts and figures. And that was it. And here was I telling the story of an old lady in Leith who, when she answered the door, she said, no, when I knocked on the door, she says, "I'll be with you in a second. I'm just sticking a brush up my back passage," which is Leith vernacular, but, you know, to someone down in London, they couldn't make head or tail of it, right? But they laughed anyway. So that was the first experience I had, and the fact that they liked that I was speaking with a passion, they hadn't heard it before. It was genuinely alien to them. A lot of them had been to very expensive public schools. And here was I talking in a totally different way. So I mentioned that because that was the first experience. And then I thought, well, that's down there. They don't understand, you know, our culture. But ever since then, and the longevity really matters, because I speak to people many years after they've heard me speak. I don't even know some of them, right? In fact, there's someone on this, she keeps disappearing, it's a shame, because she approached me at an exhibition a few years ago and said, "I'll never forget the story you told." And it was years before, right? And the impact that had. So that tells you that when you speak to people's hearts, their emotions, they remember it. It stays, because you've captured it in a story. Now, the reason I speak like that is because at school, I hated every minute. I could not sit and listen to teachers, sometimes with their back turned to the class, writing on a blackboard. You imagine that, someone who's got their back to you, speaking to you, giving you lessons, learning by rote. And I couldn't take anything, and every day at school for me was abject misery. I mean, I can't tell you how torturous it was. I would sit and I would fidget. My feet were going all the time. I was singing Beatles songs in my head. That's because that was the time of the Beatles coming out. The class, I could not focus at all. And it's only 5 months ago that I was given the diagnosis of ADHD. So it might be something to do with that. But anyway, what it taught me was that if I ever was to speak to an audience, I would never do it like that. I could not listen to anyone. And I thought, how does anyone stand up and speak in front of other people when they could take information like that? And I just couldn't. Hearing people talk, it's not hearing the words, it's hearing the meaning and the feeling behind them. So, I had a bit of a life after I was thrown out of school at 15. And I travelled to London and I was sleeping out. And then I moved to Dublin, where I was a busker on Grafton Street. It's great, people enjoying. And I was only 18 at the time. And I would go to bars where there were mixed ages. That's what it was like in those days. It wasn't...
I wouldn't be surprised.
Here's a young person's bar and here's an older person's bar. Here's a bar you wouldn't be seen dead in. It wasn't like that. So we used to drink in the bars around Grafton Street in Dublin. And I would listen to older people telling stories. Some that were talking about real experiences with the black and tans. Can you imagine? The black and tans were the horrible people appointed by the British to go and police Ireland, and they were brutal. And you're hearing first-hand stories. This is extraordinary. So I listened and I listened and I listened, and I fell in love with stories. And I fell in love with stories told with passion that people really felt. And I can remember almost every story I was told. I was fascinated by older people, not in some weird psychosexual way, just because they had stories they'd lived. And here was history. When I think about history at school, I couldn't take it in. It didn't fascinate me. Today we're going to talk about the ancient Egyptians. And I'd been in Egypt. I'd actually been in Egypt. And I said, I'd been in Egypt. And they said, well, put your hand down. It was like, what? What do you know about Egypt? You've been there. I'm the history teacher. And that's what it was like. So, coming back to now, why do I use emotion? Because when you're giving people information, there are so many different ways of doing it. You could do stats on a computer, but on a PowerPoint behind you. For example, if I said to you, look at this PowerPoint, you'll see that this is the UN's budget for 2024, and this is how much we spend on weapons worldwide, also in 2024. And you'll see there's quite a rise in the amount of weapons and a reduction in the gap, a reduction in the amount of relative spending on UN. Right, well, I looked at that figure and I say to people, the amount that we spend on weapons every year across the world is 700 times greater than what we spend on the UN. Which, I don't know if this is correct, but I suggest that means that we're spending 700 times more on things that kill people than we do on peace. That's just a rough calculation. And then I say, how does that make you feel? And straight away, you've taken a figure, you've taken a fact, and you've involved people in responding to it emotionally. Does that make sense? And you can see them shaking their heads and looking at the person sitting next to them, and you see you've started a thought process. But if you'd just shown it as a fact, as figures, it wouldn't have landed like that. People might not even have picked up this absurd anomaly, this gross injustice. To me, I speak from the heart, so I'm not going to try and say this is just facts that I'm picking up from books. This is what I'm learning through life. So that's an example. As soon as you say to people, how does that make you feel? You've got them. You've got them. Because they will immediately respond by absorbing that information and talking to people around them and looking, and you can see their eyes change, you can see their body language change, you can see the heads going from side to side. No, it's not right. See? And that's the difference. And I see so many presentations, because I'm often the last speaker, and I watched presentations before me, and they tend to be very factual. You'll know that people from government will be given a presentation from their department, and they'll go through it in quite a systematic way. But they don't feel a connection with that information, because it's the same information that everyone else is presenting, because it is the policy statement. It is the plans for 2025. It is the strategy. But a strategy can be presented in a totally different way when you think about it. So I'm not sure if I worked or in the government, I would say, no, I'm sorry, I'll have to put this into my own language, my own version of it. And they'd probably say, no, you're not allowed to do that, because this is a script. I can't read a script. And there's no part of any information, because some people say, look, what you talk about is random. You can say anything you want. But if you're presenting, facts and plans like this, you can't use emotion in that. I say, yes, I can. Yes, I can. Because if you imagine that Martin Luther King had done the reverse of what he did. He stood there and said, I have a strategic plan, and amongst those plans, I'll give you the highlights. I would like to see more integration in schools between black and white. Of course, we'd have to stagger this over years, because we can't do it all at once. That'd be too dangerous. That's what he might have said, but he didn't. He says, I have a dream. And then he says, I want to see little black boys and little black girls holding hands with little white girls and little white boys. You paint a picture. The difference between that and, trying to go through a strategic plan is huge, isn't it? It's absolutely huge. So that's what I'm talking about. There is no amount of information that cannot be wrapped in something that gives people some kind of emotional context. Doesn't matter what it is, it can be done. And stories are great ways of wrapping things up in some emotional content, because people will remember stories. They don't remember figures unless they involve a very particular kind of brain. But we have two sides to our mind. We've got the logical part, and we've got the emotional part. And the illogical part deals with facts, figures, and evidence. And people listening on the logical side of the brain will be looking to contradict it, will be looking to say, I don't know if I'm not sure I'm convinced by that. And they'll write things down, and then they'll go investigate it afterwards. People who listen with the emotional side of the brain, or if you appeal to that side of the brain, they will take it on board. It's the way you deliver it, rather than the facts and the figures. And if you think about television dramas, they're often dealing with stories and history. We've had a huge scandal in this country. If you were to write this as fiction, no one would ever believe it. It's been going on for a long, long time, where 900 people were sacked from local post offices because they'd all been taking money at the same time, apparently. And we're talking about, people being asked to leave their job. The sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses, they effectively take this like a franchise, and that is their little business, and they sell other things. They sell some groceries and some stationery. And 900 were sacked, told to leave the job immediately because they'd been taking money from the accounts, stealing from the post office. And those that were willing to admit guilt would stay out of jail. Those that didn't would be prosecuted, and many of them ended up in jail. Some died. One committed suicide. This has gone on for years and years and years. I'm talking over 20 years. And it was a software fault. A software fault. No one in the post office had the wit to think, surely we don't suddenly have a spate of thieves around the country. They didn't ask that. They just accepted that all these people were trying to thieve money from the post office. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the money still hasn't been paid. The compensation still hasn't been paid. Lives have been lost. Families' reputations have been ruined. People have killed themselves. And it still hasn't been settled in terms of the compensation to these poor people. But we didn't really talk about it in Britain. It was always featured in newspapers, periodically there were television news would show this regularly, the post office scandal. And then they did a dramatisation, a television series, based on the guy who kind of led this campaign against the post office. He was one of the postmasters. And suddenly it became the talking point. Isn't that amazing that been in the newspapers all these years, periodically it would appear, this scandal, this terrible scandal. No one really picked up on it. And then it's a dramatised series. And suddenly everyone's talking about it. And the government's panicking and the post office is panicking. There's resignations. There's a review in the courts. And suddenly things began to happen because it became a story. It was always a story, but there wasn't a sufficient, and as soon as they put names and characters, then it began to really shift people's perception. It is a massive scandal. I mean, it's the kind of thing you would expect to happen in some dark, deep banana republic state. But this was in Britain, an advanced democracy. Well, that's what we call it, isn't it? But it would not have reached the public consciousness takes me back to in the late 60s. I'd been homeless, I'd been sleeping out in London. And then there was a show, and it was a dramatisation, and it was called Cathy Come Home. And Cathy Come Home was about a young single mum with her family, and they were evicted from their home. So they were sleeping out, and of course all the things that happened to someone who's that vulnerable. I remember it in black and white, this crackly old television. Think about anything that you're talking about. It doesn't matter what the subject matter is. There is a way, evidential ways, right? Of course you need some facts, you need evidence, of course. But unless you present it in a way that really captures people's imagination and they can feel themselves in the story, then it doesn't land. Does that make sense? I've seen so many people talking about purpose, for example. You say you must have purpose. And, when you're presenting that as a kind of concept, purposefulness, it doesn't really land, does it? You don't leave a lecture theatre going, I must find purpose, because it doesn't really hold any meaning until you hear a story related to that. So I quite amazingly experienced it in South Beirut, and it was in 2006, and I was there, and it was a day after the bombing, the last big attack on Beirut, and I couldn't get in. The flight wasn't arriving in Beirut airport, so I was waiting and waiting. My aunt, who lived in Beirut, was ill. She was dying, and I was trying to get there before she died. In fact, I arrived 48 hours after she died. But I landed in Beirut, and then the first day there I went to South Beirut, and you're seeing it on television now, but I cannot tell you the feeling you get when you're walking through this rubble and the dust, the concrete dust is just filling your mouth. It's hot, it's baking hot. And you see people walking around, you see men with their hands trying to, get stuff out from under the rubble. There's a sort of eerie silence, and then you get this small bits of activity where they've suddenly found something, and you hear this yelp. And you see great slabs of concrete crushed cars, and you see all the little accoutrements of life around, tablecloths, photographs, bits of furniture, clothing. And I turned round this corner and there was a guy on top of the rubble, and he was selling clothing, but he had 2 clothes rails up. And I thought, my God, that's entrepreneurial, And I said to the guy I was with, wow, that's amazing. See, he's got customers. So I went up to this guy. My guide said to me, that was his shop 2 days ago. It got blown up. So I went over to this guy and I said, that's been horrible to lose your shop. And he said, I'm not a shopkeeper. I give people style and confidence. And I thought, wow, that's amazing that he did not consider, he saw the shop just as a vehicle. His passion was not the shop. His passion was, looking after his customers and making them feel good. And I thought that's extraordinary, because nothing would stop him doing that. Certainly not having your shop bombed, little inconvenience like that. And I thought that's purpose. And I couldn't wait to get back to Britain and tell that. And I was in when's my next speech? Because I thought that is it. That is what we talk about when we talk about purpose. I've never seen or heard a great example of that. Anyway, I go back to the main road and I said to the guy I was with, I said, that's a real road to Damascus moment. And he said, actually, you were on the road to Damascus. So you get this tail end to the story. It's true. This was extraordinary. And when I see what's happening just now, I'm not going to talk about that because it is horrific. And having seen and having been there in the midst of this mayhem, I can't tell you how horrible it is. But, you see journalists trying to be detached from the news when they're speaking about this. How can they? But that's what newscasters do. They tell the news. It's factual. But it's not. Because when you hear, they always mention the type of bombs, the kind of weapons that are used. Have you noticed that? The kind of jet fighters that are used. They always mention the brand, the branding of it. The F-15s and that's extraordinary, isn't it? Because it's a trade show for weaponry. Why would you mention the specific bombs and specific missiles on the news? It seems absurd detail when you're thinking about people's lives being lost. But that's what they're doing. But they're meant to be detached, right? And then you go to someone who's on the ground and they're not detached, are they? They're not. They're trying to be. They're trying to present information, but they can't be detached. And then you speak to someone who's in the middle of it and you get a picture, don't you? I've lost my family. I took my little boy to the hospital, but they couldn't save him. And then you're getting the reality of things. Can you imagine the stories that will be told by people when this is over? Can you imagine the stories? If anyone survives, I'm beginning to doubt it now. But I would love to get those people on stage. I would love to. Because boy, do we need to learn from this. You can't just pass it off as a piece of history. We need people who have lived through that, have suffered the trauma, have seen things, because that's the only way we'll ever find out. And so this is what I'm talking about. Things matter to us because we experience it, we feel we're sentient beings, we're not robots. And while you get people reading the news on television and it's all very factual, that's what you want, isn't it? You don't want them going, that bloody Donald Trump today. You don't want them to do it. Sorry, I'm not making a judgment here. But you want them to be impartial. You don't want them to be taking a side. You don't want to feel that they're persuading you in one way or the other. But when I stand up and speak, I want to persuade people. I want them to be aware of things. I want to get my message across. I want them to remember what I say, because there's no point in talking if people don't remember what you say, is there? So that's what I do. And the best way to do that is to, okay, you hit people's, the logical side, yes, because you give them information, but unless that information is wrapped in something else, it'll just disappear from their brain, or they'll think, I'll go and check on that when I go back and look at my computer. But if you make them feel it, it could be manipulated. I admit, I'm not there to manipulate people. But then you think about advertising. The advertising industry does it, doesn't it? In a much more malign way sometimes. You know where Santa Claus comes from? The colours red and white, yeah? It comes from Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola invented Santa Claus and the red and white outfit because it was Coca-Cola advertising. You think every child brought up, even in my generation, you think of Santa Claus, you think this is a legend that goes back a long time. It wasn't, it was Coca-Cola. It was the brand Coca-Cola that came up with the red and white outfit and the legend of Santa Claus putting presents through chimneys. That's extraordinary, isn't it? And Pepsi-Cola, when they introduced their brand in China, this is true, they got it translated into Mandarin Chinese, and Come Alive with Pepsi became Pepsi-Cola brings your relatives back from the dead. That's how it translated to Chinese. So this advertising campaign went all over China. Pepsi brings your relatives back from the dead. And people were pouring it over graves in China. That's true. Nova means no go in Spain. So, even just a mistaken translation could lead to a revolution. The wrong word said, the wrong news item going out. And now we live at a time when we're hearing voices all the time on social media. Are they telling the truth or not? No idea. I looked last night when I went to bed, it was at 1 o'clock in the morning, and I saw China was just about to attack Israel. I thought, God, no. Of course, it wasn't true. But that's going out there. It's going out in social media. So we listen to voices now. The voice has become the most powerful form of communication. Again, you think about it. Social media. How many voices do you hear if you're scrolling through Instagram or TikTok or even Facebook? It's people talking all the time. And you have to distinguish between the truth and the lie and the exaggerated and the moderate. So, telling facts, just facts. China is going to invade Israel, is going to mount an attack on Israel. That's a fact. It was just presented as a fact. But you immediately go, nah, that can't be true. If someone has said it with an urgency, you might have believed it. And that could have spread mayhem, couldn't it? So it can be abused. But the point is that everything you speak of, if it has got a emotional content in it, if it's wrapped around something emotional, even facts and figures, you can do that. And I'll give an example of that. Years ago, I was one of the founder members of Heatwise in Glasgow, and Heatwise did insulation all around the city, particularly on the social housing. And Glasgow had 85,000 social homes at the time. And many of them were so porous, they were so cold, damp. They were built for, tropical climate, Mediterranean, built on an architect called Le Corbusier's designs. Well, Le Corbusier was the south of France and Morocco, that's where he built houses. Glasgow, facing a prevailing westerly wind against the damp and the rain, it's not the same as living in the Mediterranean, the Moroccan coast. So they found that out very quickly, because a lot of the houses were damp, desperate. People with bronchitis, waking up in the morning, freezing, that you've got these stuff across the walls, black spores, horrible. And these were designed, and they were built in great numbers. So we had insulation all around the city, and after 9.5 years, I thought, if we keep saying, we've now done 72,000 homes around the city, it just gets a bit tedious, because it's like a sort of running total. And I said, we've got to find a way of presenting this. It's a bit different. So I said to the production manager, listen, I hate to do this to you, Norman, great guy. I said, I want you to calculate the insulation that we have put. This is on windows, on doors, in lofts, the works. I want you to calculate what, if we were to lay all that insulation end to end, how far it would stretch. So you can imagine, he was a bit of an engineering brain, so he actually liked the challenge. Anyway, he came back about 8 days later, and he said, right, this is the distance, right? And it was something like 4,400 miles. I thought, that's brilliant, that's amazing. You think about that. And I thought, no, we can't just say 4,400 miles. Let's try and measure that on a map and scale it. So we came up with the amount of insulation we have laid end to end would stretch from Motherwell to Moscow. Right. Motherwell, for those of you outside Scotland, there's a small town outside Glasgow, and it had that alliteration. And suddenly the people that worked for us were all out saying, the stuff we've stretched from Motherwell to Moscow. And it suddenly became, an image in people's minds. It gave it a sense of scale of the enormity of what we'd done, because we just changed the way of presenting it. And you think, everything you present, how do you do it? Is there a better way of doing it? Is there a cleverer way? I present figures every month. Can we find a different way of doing it? Yes, you can. And you can wrap it around a story. You could say, Hannibal and the elephants marched, blah, 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 blah. And you could say the distance was, and you can count the numbers into something like that. There's always a way. If you're presenting numbers, put them into Google, right? And see what comes up. And see, I once found, I think it was there 5,500 windows in the Empire State Building, right? Why did I look that up? Because we were looking at a window replacement program for a big housing association, and they had put in 5,500 windows in the previous 2 years. So I thought, wow, that's great. We've installed, enough windows to have completely filled in the spaces where the windows are in the Empire State Building. So it becomes something that people remember. And I'm not going to go on all night. I just want to get, some of these main points across. Has this been useful, Patricia? Because you were wanting very specifically.
Yes. So I wanted to join you today.
Yeah.
Because as a patient advocate and raising awareness of the condition that I have lived experience of,
yes,
I need to try and get my message across to my audience about the impact of the condition, because it's an inherited condition.
Yeah.
So I wanted to hear your views today in order to just get more experience and views on how to be impactful in my storytelling, and also just to be able to spread the message in an effective way. And I think I'm a fairly good storyteller, but there's always improvements that you can make.
Yes. And look, I think that when you're telling a story about your experience of something, you do tell, I wake up in the morning, and this is what happens, and this is how I feel, this is what I can do, this is what I can't do, this is how it affects me, what it makes me feel, how does it affect anything else that you're doing? Does it restrict your life when you're in particular situations? Maybe we should have a chat, actually. If I, separate from this, I would be willing to spend some time on Zoom with you.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd love to do that. Yeah.
Yes.
Just to be able to feed back them as well in my area that I'm trying to work in advocacy. And I work not just in Scotland, I work on the European and global level. So your input might be very interesting.
That's great.
I work with the Global Heart Hub and Efforts Europe and Heart UK. So I'm on all different levels of advocacy.
Right, we'll arrange that. We've got your details, so we'll get a message to you and we'll arrange to do something. And we'll pick up on some of the things you say and say, how can we do that in a different way? And of course, if other people want to learn as well, we can do a wee sheet for you as well. Okay?
Okay, lovely. Thank you.
Okay. And I suppose that's why, I do things like this, because this boy was just proving everything. He didn't know that'll never work. And I said to him, can I make you the head of optimism? Right? And he said, okay. And from then on, if anyone had any doubts, they would say, no, do look at the positive side of this. It's going to work. And it was just amazing. He took on this role. So they love the opportunity to talk, but they don't think anyone wants to listen to them. And, I've got a real passion about this. I would love the Scottish Government to do this in schools, to create a programme all around Scotland, because we need people who can express themselves. Whatever job they go into, they'll be depended on to speak, to make connections with people. I think this is so important. So that's what I'd like to be doing for the rest of my life, in fact. Working with young people, saying this is how you present. And having done it with a 15-year-old who'd had a terrible life, that will have changed her life forever. I know that. Of course, I've not kept contact with her at all. That would have been difficult. You can't say, give me your email address. But I know that will have changed her life. Because when you learn that you've got something to say, when you learn that people will listen to you, when you learn that what you say has an impact on people emotionally, then you've got yourself into a place that's going to be really important in your future. And I don't think we do that enough. The most impressive speakers to me are Black Americans. And I tell you what, I think it's because of the way that the services are, the songs, the gospel thing, the gospel choirs. It's got a rhythm to it, and that's where Mandela came from, and so many others, Jesse Jones and all these people, Jesse Owens. They're great speakers. They've just got this natural ability to speak emotionally and connect with people. If we don't converse, we don't make those connections, and you think of how many of these incredible connections we make through life just by chatting to people. I want to put a course together I've just been experimenting with this. I want to put a course together of 4 different sessions. Would you be interested in attending?
I would.
I would look at it, Mike. I would look at, put the course together, put the outline together. I'll definitely look at it,
Okay. But there's actually a purpose behind this, because I want more people to start speaking and start expressing themselves and start, learning the art of persuasion and the art of the argument as well, debating.
I'm happy to spread the message on LinkedIn because I have over 20,000 connections.
I would love you to spread the message.
Thank you.
Because it's about spreading the message separately.
You have some comments in the chat, Mike. Did you see?
Yes, please.
You've got some comments. You have some good ones. You might want to check it out.
Oh, is it? Right. That's brilliant. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Listen, thank you so much for coming.